Welcome back. Settle in, breathe slowly, and let your thoughts drift. Tonight, we gently step into the world of Fred and George Weasley. In the magical world, there are individuals who leave marks through power, through wisdom, through sacrifice. Then there are those who leave their mark through joy, through laughter, through an unshakable belief that even in the darkest times, there must be light. Fred and George Weasley were such individuals. Identical twins born into a large, loving, and often chaotic family. They would grow to become more than just pranksters or joke shop owners. They would become symbols of resistance, entrepreneurs who changed wizarding commerce, warriors who fought in a terrible war, and most importantly, brothers whose bond transcended even death itself. Their story begins on April 1st, 1978, a date that seems almost too perfect for two boys who would spend their lives making others laugh. Born to Arthur and Molly Weasley at the family home known as the Burrow, Fred and George entered a world already bustling with activity. They were not the first Weasley children, nor would they be the last. When they arrived, squalling and red-haired like all Weasleys, their older brothers, Bill, Charlie, and Percy, were already part of the household. Later would come Ron, and finally their only sister, Ginny. The Burrow would ring with the sounds of 7 children growing up together, learning magic, fighting, laughing, and forming bonds that would last their entire lives. The Burrow itself was a remarkable place, though not in the way that grand wizarding estates were remarkable. It was a ramshackle building that seemed to defy the laws of physics, held together as much by magic as by any physical structure. It leaned at odd angles, with rooms added on, seemingly at random as the family grew. The house had a warmth to it, though, a sense of love and belonging that no amount of money could buy. There were always people in every room, always noise, always something happening. For Fred and George, growing up in this environment shaped them in fundamental ways. They learned early that if you wanted attention in a house full of children, you had to be creative. You had to be memorable. You had to make people laugh. Arthur Weasley, their father, worked at the Ministry of Magic in the Misuse of Muggle Artifacts office. It was not a prestigious position, and it certainly was not a lucrative one. Arthur's fascination with Muggle objects was seen as eccentric at best by most of the wizarding world. He would bring home plugs and batteries, trying to understand how they worked, filling the Burrow with strange Muggle contraptions that sometimes functioned and sometimes exploded in showers of sparks. For Fred and George, their father's workshop became a place of wonder. Here was a man who looked at objects and asked not what they were supposed to do, but what they could do if you changed them, improved them, made them into something new. This philosophy would deeply influence the twins as they grew older. Molly Weasley, their mother, was the heart of the family in every sense. She cooked and cleaned and mended clothes with magic and by hand, stretching their limited resources to feed 7 hungry children. She was fierce in her love and equally fierce in her discipline. Molly had high expectations for her children, wanting them to succeed, to be safe, to have better lives than the hand-to-mouth existence the family often faced. She worried constantly, especially as her boys grew older and the world grew darker. For Fred and George, their mother's love was a constant, even when they tested her patience with their pranks and their rule-breaking. They knew, even when she was shouting herself hoarse at them, that she loved them unconditionally. Growing up as identical twins gave Fred and George something unique among their siblings. They had a built-in best friend, a partner in crime, someone who understood them without words. From their earliest years, they developed a way of communicating that was almost telepathic. They could finish each other's sentences, could plan pranks with just a look, could work together with a synchronization that amazed everyone who saw it. They were not just brothers. They were two halves of a whole, functioning together better than either could alone. This bond would define their entire lives, making their eventual separation all the more tragic. The Weasley children all had distinct personalities, despite their similar upbringing. Bill, the eldest, was the cool older brother who went off to work for Gringotts in Egypt, bringing back tales of curse breaking and pyramids. Charlie was obsessed with dragons, eventually going to Romania to work with them. Percy was studious and rule-following to a fault, always trying to distinguish himself through academic achievement, and later through ministry connections. Ron, closer in age to the twins, often felt overshadowed by his older brother's achievements. Ginny, the youngest and only girl, had to fight for her place in a house full of brothers. Fred and George fit into this lineup as the troublemakers, the ones who could always be counted on to do something unexpected, to push boundaries, to make the serious moments lighter with well-timed jokes. But beneath the pranks and the laughter, Fred and George were deeply observant children. They saw how hard their parents worked, how their mother would repair their robes again and again because there was no money for new ones, how their father's position at the ministry earned him ridicule from wealthier pure-blood families. They saw Percy's embarrassment at their poverty, his determination to rise above his family's status. They saw Ron's hand-me-down everything, his constant comparison to his older brother's achievements. They saw all of this, and they made a choice. Instead of being bitter or ashamed, instead of letting their family's financial struggles define them negatively, they decided to embrace joy. They would be the ones who made everyone laugh, who reminded people that there were more important things than money or status or appearances. Their early magical incidents were legendary within the family. All young witches and wizards experience moments of accidental magic before they learn control, but Fred and George seemed to have more than their fair share of incidents. When they were 5 years old, Fred turned Ron's teddy bear into a giant spider because Ron broke his toy broomstick. The prank was effective, too effective really, and Ron would carry a fear of spiders for the rest of his life. The twins felt guilty about this in their way, though they never quite apologized properly for it. When they were 7, they tried to make Percy take an unbreakable vow about something trivial, not understanding the deadly serious nature of such magic. Arthur caught them just in time and explained in no uncertain terms that some forms of magic were not for pranking. Another incident, when they were around 6, involved Fred or George. Nobody was ever quite sure which, turning Percy's ministry badge into a spider. This was before Percy even went to Hogwarts, when the badge was just a toy, but it showed the twins' early talent for transfiguration. They could change objects, could make them into something else, could see the potential in everything around them. This skill would later become fundamental to their business, their ability to take ordinary objects and transform them into products that brought joy and chaos in equal measure. The twins were inseparable from birth, but they were not identical in personality. Fred tended to be slightly more outgoing, the one who spoke first in conversations, the one who was perhaps a touch more reckless in his pranking. George was often described as slightly more compassionate, though this is relative when discussing two boys who once fed Dudley Dursley a Tung-Tung toffee. The differences between them were subtle, visible mainly to those who knew them best. Their family could tell them apart fairly reliably, though even Molly sometimes got confused when they were deliberately trying to trick her. To the outside world, they were simply the twins, treated as a unit rather than as individuals. This lack of individual recognition from others actually strengthened their bond. If the world was going to see them as one entity, they would embrace it. They developed their own language of sorts, their own private jokes and references that only they fully understood. They moved in sync, often wearing matching or similar clothes, deliberately playing up their twinness because it gave them an advantage. People expected twins to be alike, so Fred and George used those expectations, swapped identities when convenient, confused teachers and students alike with their seamless coordination. It was armor in a way, protection against a world that might judge them for their poverty or their family's status. As long as they had each other, as long as they could laugh together, nothing else really mattered. The Burrow was always full of laughter, but it was also full of love. Family dinners were chaotic affairs with everyone talking over each other, asking for food to be passed, telling stories about their day. Arthur would tell stories about his work at the ministry, about the ridiculous ways wizards misused muggle objects. Molly would fuss over whether everyone had eaten enough, would remind Percy about his homework, or Bill about some responsibility he had. The twins would be planning their next prank, kicking each other under the table in silent communication. Ron would be trying to get a word in, edgewise. Ginny, when she was old enough, would be watching everything, learning from her brother's mistakes and successes. Holidays at the Burrow were special. Christmas meant a tree decorated with magical ornaments, presents wrapped in brown paper, because fancy wrapping was an unnecessary expense, and Molly's cooking filling the house with incredible smells. The presents were never expensive. The twins usually received homemade sweaters from Molly, each with their initial on the front. They wore them despite the teasing they gave Percy for his sweaters, because they knew how much work went into them, how much love was stitched into every stitch. There would be games of wizard chess, of exploding snap, of whatever new things the twins had invented. Arthur might give them something from work, some muggle gadget he had confiscated that seemed relatively safe. It was not wealth, but it was richness of a different kind. Summer holidays were times of freedom and exploration. The twins would roam the countryside around the Burrow, would visit the nearby village, would experiment with magic and mayhem in equal measure. They turned the ghoul in the attic into a source of entertainment rather than fear. They explored every inch of the ramshackle house, finding secret spots and hiding places that even their older brothers did not know about. They practiced Quidditch in the orchard, using old brooms and homemade equipment, developing the skills that would later make them valuable players on the Gryffindor team. They argued and fought like all siblings do, but always made up quickly, the twin bond too strong to allow prolonged anger. As they approached their 11th birthday, the twins began to anticipate their Hogwarts letters with growing excitement. Bill, Charlie, and Percy had all gone before them, each bringing back stories about the castle, the classes, the adventures they had. The twins could hardly wait for their turn. They had plans, so many plans, for the mischief they would cause at Hogwarts. They had heard stories about the Marauders, the legendary pranksters who had attended Hogwarts years before, though they did not yet know that their future friend Lee Jordan would help them find the Marauders' map. They dreamed of becoming legends themselves, of pranks that would be talked about for years after they left. When their Hogwarts letters finally arrived on April 1st, 1989, delivered by Owl as all Hogwarts letters were, Fred and George were ecstatic. Molly wept, as she would weep when each of her children received their letters, torn between joy at their growing up and sadness at them leaving home. Arthur beamed with pride, already planning the trip to Diagon Alley to buy their school supplies. The twins read their letters over and over, memorizing the list of required books and equipment, imagining the castle they would soon call home for much of the year. The trip to Diagon Alley was an adventure. The family did not have much money, so most of their supplies were second-hand. Their robes were bought used from Madame Malkin's. Their cauldrons were the basic pewter model rather than anything fancy. Their books were purchased from a shop that sold used texts with notes and doodles from previous students in the margins. The only new things they received were their wands, because wands had to choose the wizard, had to be personal and unique. Fred's wand ended up being made of unknown wood, though likely something sturdy and reliable. George's wand similarly chose him, recognizing something in the young wizard that made them compatible. The twins waved their new wands around the shop, making Ollivander nervous with their enthusiasm and their tendency to nearly break things, even before they had learned any actual spells. They visited Flourish and Blots for their textbooks, Slug and Jiggers, Apothecary for basic potion ingredients, the Apothecary for their telescope and other equipment. Every purchase was carefully considered. Every galleon spent was one that Molly counted twice to make sure they had enough. The twins noticed this, noticed how their mother worried over every item on the list, how she chose the cheapest option whenever possible. They saw Percy's slightly pitying looks, as if he was embarrassed to be seen with them in their obvious poverty. They saw it all, and they promised themselves that someday they would be successful enough that money would never be a worry for their family again. The most magical moment of that Diagon Alley trip was visiting Weasley's Wizard Wheezes. Wait, that is wrong. The shop did not exist yet. The most magical moment was actually visiting Gamble and Jape's joke shop, the premier joke shop in Diagon Alley at the time. The twins pressed their noses against the window, marveling at the dung bombs and hicko sweets and screaming yo-yos on display. They could not afford to buy much, but they spent what little pocket money they had on a few basic joke items, studying them carefully, taking them apart mentally to figure out how they worked. Even then, they were thinking about improvement, about what they could create that would be better, funnier, more impressive than what was currently available. On September 1st, 1989, Fred and George Weasley boarded the Hogwarts Express for the first time. Platform 9 3/4 was crowded with families saying goodbye to their children, owls hooting in their cages, cats meowing, toads trying to escape. Molly fussed over the twins, making sure they had everything, reminding them to behave themselves, to study hard, to write home regularly. Arthur shook their hands solemnly, treating them like young men rather than children, telling them to learn everything they could, to ask questions, to never stop being curious. Percy, already at Hogwarts for 2 years, gave them unnecessary advice about following rules and not causing trouble, advice that the twins immediately decided to ignore. The train ride to Hogwarts was everything the twins had hoped it would be. They found a compartment with Lee Jordan, a boy their age with dreadlocks and an outrageous sense of humor that matched their own perfectly. The three of them bonded almost instantly, recognizing kindred spirits in each other. Lee had a tarantula named Arnold that he kept in a box, much to the horror of some of the other first years who peeked into their compartment. Fred and George loved it immediately, though Fred was less enthusiastic about spiders after the incident with Ron. They spent the journey comparing expectations about Hogwarts, speculating about which house they would be sorted into, and beginning to plan their first prank as Hogwarts students. The sorting ceremony was held in the Great Hall, a room so magnificent that even the twins fell silent when they first saw it. The ceiling was enchanted to look like the night sky. Floating candles provided light. The 4 house tables stretched the length of the hall, and the staff table sat on a raised platform at the front. The sorting hat, patched and frayed with age, sat on a stool waiting to sort the new students into Gryffindor, Hufflepuff, Ravenclaw, or Slytherin. The twins waited as names were called alphabetically, watching students sit on the stool and have the hat placed on their heads. Some sortings were quick, others took longer as the hat deliberated. When Weasley Fred was called, Fred walked up confidently and sat on the stool. The sorting hat was placed on his head, far too large and slipping down over his eyes. There was a pause, a moment of consideration, and then the hat's voice rang out clearly. "Gryffindor!" The Gryffindor table erupted in cheers. Percy was clapping, looking pleased that his brothers would be in the same house. Fred walked to the table, grinning, high-fiving some of the older students he passed. Then it was George's turn. Weasley, George, was called moments later. George sat on the stool, the hat was placed on his head, and the sorting was even quicker. "Gryffindor!" Again the cheers, again the welcome, and now both twins were seated at the Gryffindor table together, as they had been together for everything else in their lives. The sorting hat's choice made sense for Fred and George. Gryffindor valued bravery, daring, nerve, and chivalry, qualities the twins possessed in abundance, even if they showed them in unconventional ways. They were not brave in the way that warriors were brave, though they would prove to be that as well when war came. They were brave in their willingness to break rules they thought were unjust, to stand up to authority when they believed authority was wrong, to face consequences for their actions with smiles on their faces. They had nerve to attempt the pranks they dreamed up, to turn their ideas into reality even when the risks were substantial. They were loyal to their friends and family, would defend anyone they cared about regardless of the cost. Gryffindor was absolutely the right house for them. Their first year at Hogwarts was a time of discovery and adjustment. They had to learn the castle's layout, a task made more difficult by the moving staircases and the trick steps that everyone forgot about. They had to learn where classrooms were, how to avoid Filch the caretaker and his cat Mrs. Norris, which passages were shortcuts and which were dead ends. They discovered the kitchens, located behind a painting of a fruit bowl near the Hufflepuff common room, where house elves would give them food if they asked nicely. They found hidden rooms and forgotten corners, mapping the castle in their minds, storing away information that would be useful for future pranks. Classes were a mixed experience for the twins. They were intelligent, there was no question about that. They could learn spells and potions and theory when they wanted to, but they were easily bored by subjects that did not interest them. History of magic, taught by the ghost Professor Binns, was torture for them. The professor droned on in a monotone voice about goblin rebellions and giant wars, never noticing when students fell asleep or stopped paying attention. Fred and George used History of Magic class to plan pranks, to sketch out ideas for joke products, to pass notes to each other and lee about anything other than the lesson. They scraped through with barely acceptable marks, doing just enough to avoid failing. Potions, taught by Professor Severus Snape in the dungeons, was more interesting but more dangerous. Snape had little patience for Gryffindors, seemed to take pleasure in criticizing their work, and assigned detentions with alarming frequency. The twins found him deeply unfair, noticed how he favored Slytherin students, how he was quicker to punish Gryffindors for infractions that Slytherins got away with. They disliked him intensely, made him a target for some of their pranks over the years, though they were careful about it. Snape was not someone you wanted as an enemy. He was clever, vindictive, and had the power to make your life miserable if you crossed him too openly. Transfiguration, taught by Professor Minerva McGonagall, was one of their better subjects. McGonagall was strict but fair, demanding excellence but willing to help students who put in the effort. She had high standards for all her students, regardless of their house. The twins respected her, even as they occasionally drove her to distraction with their antics. Transfiguration came naturally to them, the ability to transform objects into other objects, to change their fundamental nature. This skill would later become crucial to their business. Their ability to create products that transformed or affected the world around them. Charms, taught by the diminutive Professor Flitwick, was another subject where they excelled when they bothered to apply themselves. Flitwick was enthusiastic about magic, making his classes engaging and interesting. He taught them practical spells, useful magic that could be applied to everyday situations. The twins paid attention here, recognizing the value of what they were learning. Many of their later products would combine transfiguration and charms work, creating objects that behaved in unexpected and hilarious ways. Defense against the dark arts had a different teacher in their first year, as it seemed to every year. The position was rumored to be cursed, with no teacher lasting more than a single year. Whoever taught it during the twins' first year is not particularly memorable. Another in a long line of professors who came and went. The twins learned the basics of defending themselves against dark creatures and dark magic. But the real education in defense would come later, when they joined Dumbledore's army and learned practical defensive magic in a context that actually mattered. Flying lessons, held on the grounds under Madam Hooch's instruction, were where Fred and George truly shone. They took to flying naturally, as many Weasleys did. They were fearless on broomsticks, willing to attempt dangerous maneuvers, quick to learn techniques that other students struggled with. It became clear early on that they had talent as flyers, the kind of natural ability that Quidditch teams dreamed of finding. By the end of their first year, they were already being noticed by Oliver Wood, the Gryffindor keeper and Quidditch team captain, as potential recruits for the team. Their first prank at Hogwarts was relatively simple but effective. They managed to charm a dozen owls to deliver singing valentines on Valentine's Day, not to their intended recipients, but to random students throughout the school. The messages were absurd, declaring love from unlikely sources, creating confusion and laughter throughout the Great Hall during breakfast. They were never caught for this prank, mostly because half the school was pulling similar stunts for Valentine's Day, and the twins had been careful not to leave evidence pointing back to them. As the year went on, their reputation as troublemakers grew. They set off dung bombs in corridors, causing evacuations and terrible smells. They charmed suits of armor to sing opera when people walked past. They turned a corridor's floor into a temporary swamp, using a combination of charms and conjuration that would later inspire their portable swamp product. They received detentions regularly, served them with good humor, and went right back to pranking as soon as they were released. The teachers were frustrated with them, but even McGonagall had to hide smiles sometimes at their more creative efforts. Their relationship with Percy became more strained during their first year at Hogwarts. Percy was a fourth year by then, deeply invested in his role as a prefect and his academic standing. He saw the twins' behavior as an embarrassment, worried that their reputation would reflect badly on him. He would scold them when he caught them in the act of pranking, would assign them detentions when he could, would write home to their mother about their misbehavior. The twins found this betrayal particularly stinging. They understood that Percy was different from them, that he valued rules and authority in ways they never would. but they had not expected him to actively work against them. The tension with Percy highlighted a fundamental difference in philosophy. Percy believed that success came through following rules, through working within the system, through earning the approval of authority figures. Fred and George believed that rules were often arbitrary, that authority was not always right, that true success came from thinking independently and standing up for what you believed in, even when it was difficult. Neither approach was entirely wrong, but they were incompatible, leading to conflicts that would eventually tear the family apart during the war years. Their first year ended with the crisis involving the Philosopher's Stone. Though Fred and George were not directly involved in those events, they knew something was happening, noticed Harry Potter and his friends acting strangely, saw the increased security around the school. When it all came out that Harry had faced Voldemort in some form and had saved the stone from being stolen, the twins were impressed. Here was this first-year student, young and still learning, who had shown incredible bravery. They made a mental note that Harry Potter was someone worth knowing, someone who might be a valuable ally in their ongoing war against boredom and authority. Summer at the Burrow, after their first year, was glorious. They had so much to tell their parents, so many stories about Hogwarts and their pranks and the friends they had made. Molly was torn between pride at their magical accomplishments and frustration at the number of detentions they had received. Arthur was quietly impressed by some of their more elaborate pranks, asking detailed questions about how they had managed certain magical effects. They spent the summer experimenting with new ideas, working on prototypes for joke products they hoped to create, playing Quidditch in the orchard, and generally enjoying their freedom. Their second year began with both excitement and trepidation. They had learned the previous year that Hogwarts could be dangerous, that beneath the magic and the wonder there were real threats. But they were also older now, more confident, more skilled. They returned to Hogwarts, ready to build on their reputation, to attempt bigger and better pranks, to make their mark on the school in more permanent ways. They also, finally, tried out for the Gryffindor Quidditch team and were accepted as beaters, positions they would hold for most of their Hogwarts career. Being beaters meant protecting their teammates from the opposing team's bludgers, heavy iron balls that flew around trying to knock players off their brooms. It required strength, timing, and a certain aggressive streak that Fred and George possessed in abundance. They were good at it, really good. They worked together with the same synchronization they brought to everything else, able to anticipate each other's movements, to set up plays where one would drive a bludger toward an opponent, and the other would be perfectly positioned to follow up. Oliver Wood, their captain, was demanding and intense about Quidditch, holding brutal practice sessions in all weather conditions, but Fred and George thrived under his leadership. Quidditch gave them an outlet for their competitive nature and their physical energy. It also gave them status within Gryffindor House. They were not just pranksters now. They were athletes, members of the house team, contributors to Gryffindor's success in ways that even Percy had to acknowledge. When Gryffindor won matches, the twins were celebrated. When they lost, they were consoled. Quidditch created bonds between them and their teammates that would last long after they left Hogwarts. It was during their second year that they acquired one of the most important tools in their pranking arsenal, the Marauder's map. The full story of how they got it has become somewhat legendary. According to their own telling, they were in their first year when they managed to set off a dung bomb in a corridor near Filch's office. Filch caught them, as he often did, and dragged them to his office for punishment. While Filch was ranting about the appropriate consequences for their behavior, yelling about how students in his day would have been hung by their thumbs in the dungeons, Fred and George noticed a drawer in his desk labeled confiscated and highly dangerous. Being the twins they were, this label was basically an invitation. They managed to distract Filch somehow, probably with some additional small act of chaos. And while he was dealing with that, one of them, probably George, though they never confirmed which, lifted the drawer open. Inside were various confiscated items from students over the years, but one item stood out. A blank piece of parchment that seemed to call to them somehow. They pocketed it, took their detention with as much grace as they could muster, and left Filch's office with their prize. The parchment appeared to be blank at first, just an old piece of parchment that someone had thought important enough to confiscate. But Fred and George were not ones to accept things at face value. They tried various spells on it, spoke to it, attempted different phrases, and eventually stumbled upon the activation phrase. I solemnly swear that I am up to no good. When spoken, while tapping the parchment with a wand, the map revealed itself. Lines spread across the parchment like ink in water, forming a detailed map of Hogwarts Castle showing every room, every corridor, every secret passage. More than that, it showed people, little dots with names attached moving through the castle in real time. The map was a revelation, a game changer. With it, the twins could see where teachers were, could avoid running into Filch or Mrs. Norris, could find secret passages to move through the castle unseen. The map listed passages they had never known existed, routes that led to Hogsmeade and other places outside the castle. It became their most valuable tool, allowing them to plan pranks with precision, to escape detection, to be anywhere they needed to be. They treasured the map, kept it secret from almost everyone, used it constantly throughout their remaining years at Hogwarts. What they did not know at first was the history of the map, who had created it. The map had been made by 4 students calling themselves Moony, Wormtail, Padfoot, and Prongs. These were, respectively, Remus Lupin, Peter Pettigrew, Sirius Black, and James Potter, Harry's father. The Marauders had created the map during their own time at Hogwarts, had used it for their own pranks and adventures. In a way, when Fred and George found the map, they were inheriting a legacy of mischief, continuing a tradition that stretched back to their parents' generation. They did not learn this history until much later, but when they did, it made the map even more special. They were carrying on the work of legendary pranksters, walking in the footsteps of the Marauders themselves. The map also had a security feature. If someone tried to read it while being unworthy or hostile, the map would respond with insults. Mr. Mooney presents his compliments to Professor Snape and begs him to keep his abnormally large nose out of other people's business. Messages like these would appear, protecting the map's secrets from those who would use it to stop pranks rather than enable them. Fred and George loved this feature, appreciated the personality of the map's creators coming through even years after they had graduated. The second year was also marked by the Chamber of Secrets crisis, though again, Fred and George were not directly involved in the main events. They noticed when students started being petrified, turned to stone by some mysterious force. They saw the fear spreading through the school, the way parents started withdrawing their children, worried about the safety of Hogwarts. They joked about it sometimes because that was their nature, but they were also genuinely concerned. When Ginny, their little sister, was taken into the chamber and nearly died, their joking stopped entirely. They waited with their family in terrible suspense, fearing the worst, until Harry managed to save her and destroy the basilisk. The incident with Ginny changed something for the twins. Up until then, Hogwarts had been a playground, a a place where the most serious consequences of their actions were detentions and house point losses. But Ginny had nearly died. The school itself had been in danger of closing. The world was more dangerous than they had fully appreciated, and their family was not immune to that danger. They were still pranksters after that, still caused chaos and laughter, but there was perhaps a slightly more serious edge to them, a recognition that there were real dangers in the world that required real responses. Their third year was more routine, at least in comparison to the previous two. The crisis that year involved Sirius Black escaping from Azkaban and allegedly hunting Harry Potter. But the twins' daily lives were not dramatically affected. They continued their Quidditch playing, continued their pranking, continued developing their skills, both magical and entrepreneurial. They were taking more advanced classes now, learning more complex magic, finding new ways to apply their knowledge. They experimented constantly, combining spells in unexpected ways, pushing the boundaries of what was supposed to be possible. It was around this time that they started seriously thinking about their future. They were halfway through their Hogwarts education, would be taking their ordinary wizarding level exams in 2 years. Most students at this point started thinking about careers, about what they wanted to do after school. Percy had always known he wanted to work at the Ministry. Bill had known he wanted to be a curse breaker. Charlie had known he wanted to work with dragons. But Fred and George wanted something different. They did not want to work for someone else, did not want to climb some corporate ladder at the Ministry. They wanted to create something of their own, to build something that reflected who they were. They wanted to make people laugh for a living, to turn their passion for pranking into an actual business. The idea of a joke shop, their own joke shop, started taking root during their third year. The problem, of course, was money. Starting a business required capital, required funds for inventory and rent and all the other expenses that came with running a shop. The Weasley family had no money to spare. Molly and Arthur were still struggling to provide for 7 children, still counting every galleon, still buying second-hand whenever possible. Fred and George could not ask their parents for startup money. It would not be fair, and it would not be available anyway. So they began thinking about other ways to fund their future business. They started small, selling their own creations to fellow students, building up a small reserve of coins from their early products. Their 4th year brought the Tri-Wizard Tournament to Hogwarts, an event that would prove to be both exciting and tragic. The tournament brought students from Beauxbatons Academy and Durmstrang Institute to Hogwarts for the year, creating a more international atmosphere. The Yule Ball was announced, requiring dress robes that the Weasley family could barely afford. Molly sent Fred and George dress robes that were old-fashioned and horrible, covered in lace that looked ridiculous on teenage boys. They wore them anyway because they had no choice, but they hated every moment of it. It was another reminder of their family's poverty, another moment of embarrassment in front of their wealthier peers. When Harry's name came out of the Goblet of Fire as an unexpected 4th champion, Fred and George were initially skeptical, along with everyone else. They wondered how he had managed it, how he had bypassed the age line that Dumbledore had placed around the goblet to prevent underage students from entering. They had tried to cross that age line themselves using Aging Potion, an attempt that failed spectacularly when the potion caused them both to sprout long white beards and forced them to visit Madame Pomfrey in the hospital wing for treatment. But once they accepted that Harry had not entered himself, that something dangerous was afoot, they became supportive, defending him against students who accused him of cheating or attention-seeking. The first task of the tournament involved facing dragons, massive and deadly creatures that could kill a wizard with a single blast of fire. Fred and George, along with Lee Jordan, organized betting on the outcome, taking wagers from students about who would survive, who would score highest, who would manage to retrieve the golden egg that was the goal of the task. They made a tidy sum from the betting, showing their entrepreneurial instincts and their willingness to capitalize on any situation that presented itself. When Harry successfully completed the task, retrieving his egg and tying for first place, the twins collected their winnings and paid out to those who had bet on his success. The Yule Ball was a memorable night, even with the terrible dress robes. Fred attended with Angelina Johnson, one of his Quidditch teammates and a fellow Gryffindor. George went with another Gryffindor girl whose name has been lost to history. They danced, they laughed, they enjoyed the spectacle of the event, even if their clothes were embarrassing. They watched Percy dancing with his girlfriend Penelope Clearwater, watched Ron make a disaster of asking Hermione Granger to be his date too late after she had already accepted Victor Crumb's invitation. The ball was a rare moment of pure celebration in what was becoming an increasingly dark time. The second task took place in the Black Lake, with champions having to rescue someone they cared about from the lake's depths. The third task was a maze filled with dangerous creatures and obstacles, with the Tri-Wizard Cup at its center. Fred and George watched both tasks with the rest of the school, cheering for Harry, marveling at the magic on display, never imagining how the tournament would end. When Cedric Diggory was killed, and Harry returned claiming that Voldemort had returned, the mood at Hogwarts changed dramatically. The name that had been barely whispered for 13 years was suddenly being spoken again, bringing with it fear and uncertainty. The twins believed Harry immediately when he said Voldemort had returned. They had always been good judges of character, and they knew Harry was not lying. When much of the wizarding world turned against him, when the Ministry and the Daily Prophet began a campaign to discredit him, and Dumbledore, Fred and George stood firm in their support, they had spent enough time around Harry to know he was honest, brave, and certainly not someone who would make up stories for attention. If Harry said Voldemort was back, then Voldemort was back, and the fact that the Ministry was denying it was just more proof that the Ministry was full of idiots. Their 5th year was perhaps the most important of their time at Hogwarts in terms of their development and their future. Dolores Umbridge arrived at the school as the new defense against the dark arts teacher, sent by the Ministry to keep an eye on Dumbledore and to control what students were being taught. Umbridge was a petty tyrant, dressed in pink and speaking in a sickeningly sweet voice that barely concealed her cruel nature. She implemented educational decrees that gave her increasing power over the school, banned certain topics from being discussed, and used genuinely dark magic as punishment for students who disobeyed her. Fred and George hated Umbridge from the moment they met her. Everything about her represented what they despised: authoritarian control, arbitrary rules designed to consolidate power rather than to protect or educate, the abuse of authority to hurt those who could not fight back. When Umbridge used a blood quill on Harry, a cursed object that carved words into the back of his hand, using his own blood as ink, the twins were furious. This was not detention. This was torture. And the fact that a Ministry official felt comfortable using such methods on a student showed how corrupted the system had become. Umbridge banned all student organizations and gatherings, a rule clearly designed to prevent students from organizing against her. In response, Hermione Granger organized a secret defense group, students who would learn practical defensive magic since Umbridge refused to teach it in class. The group needed a name, and it was Ginny who suggested Dumbledore's Army, both because Dumbledore was being persecuted by the Ministry and because the name would particularly infuriate Umbridge. Fred and George joined immediately, bringing their energy and their creativity to the group. Dumbledore's army, or the DA as it came to be called, met in the Room of Requirement, a magical room that appeared only when someone needed it and provided whatever that person required. Harry taught them defensive spells, practical magic that they could use to protect themselves. The Patronus charm, which created a guardian made of positive energy that could drive away Dementors. Stunning spells and shield charms. Disarming techniques and dodging strategies. Fred and George threw themselves into these lessons with enthusiasm. They were learning magic that was genuinely useful, that might save their lives or the lives of people they cared about. This was not abstract theory or pointless historical dates. This was practical preparation for a war they knew was coming. The twins excelled at defensive magic when they actually focused on it. Their Patronuses, the positive energy guardians that took the form of animals, were both magpies, twin birds known for their intelligence and their mischievous nature. The fact that their Patronuses matched surprised no one. Even their protective guardians reflected their twin bond, their essential similarity despite their individual differences. They practiced dueling with other DA members, learning how to fight multiple opponents, how to protect others while defending themselves, how to think tactically in the chaos of combat. But as much as they valued what Dumbledore's army was teaching them, Fred and George were also developing other plans. They were increasingly convinced that they should leave Hogwarts before completing their final year, before taking their NSWT exams. They had learned what they needed to learn. They had developed products that they could sell. They had a business plan, however rough. The only thing holding them back was money, and that problem was about to be solved in an unexpected way. Harry Potter gave them the solution. After the Tri-Wizard tournament, Harry had won 1,000 galleons in prize money. But the money was tainted for him, associated with Cedric's death, with the return of Voldemort, with one of the worst nights of his life. He did not want it, could not stand to look at it. When he offered it to Fred and George to help start their joke shop, they initially refused. It was too much, too generous. And they knew Harry could use the money himself. But Harry insisted. He told them that they had given him so much laughter over the years, had made Hogwarts better with their presence, and he wanted to invest in their future. More than that, he wanted something good to come from the tournament, wanted the prize money to create joy, rather than sitting in his vault as a reminder of death. Fred and George accepted, deeply moved by Harry's generosity and his faith in them. They promised him that they would pay him back, would give him free products for life, would make sure he never regretted his investment. They took the 1,000 galleons and began seriously planning their shop. They started developing products in earnest, testing them on fellow students, refining their formulas and their enchantments. They ordered materials through Owlpost, experimented in abandoned classrooms, and gradually built up an inventory of items that would form the core of their future business. Their products during this time became increasingly sophisticated. They created skiving snack boxes, sweets that would make the eater temporarily ill in various ways, allowing students to skip classes they wanted to avoid. Each snack box contained 2 sweets, one that caused the illness and one that cured it. There were fainting fancies that made you pass out, fever fudge that gave you a high temperature, nosebleed nougat that caused dramatic nosebleeds, and puking pastilles that induced vomiting. The genius was in the control. Students could take the illness-inducing sweet, get sent to the hospital wing, or dismissed from class, and then take the cure once they were safely away. They developed extendable ears, flesh-colored strings enchanted to act as long-distance listening devices. One end could be dropped down a staircase or slid under a door, and the other end would relay whatever conversation was happening at the far end. These proved enormously popular with students wanting to eavesdrop on teachers or on each other. The twins themselves used extendable ears to listen in on Order of the Phoenix meetings at Grimmauld Place during the summer, desperate to know what was happening in the war that adults insisted on keeping them out of. They created decoy detonators, small horn-like devices that would run around causing distractions, exploding with loud bangs and smoke, drawing attention away from the user. They developed Peruvian instant darkness powder, a substance that created total darkness when released, allowing for quick escapes or for creating confusion. They worked on a range of defense items as well, shield hats and shield cloaks that would deflect minor hexes and jinxes, turning practical defense into fashionable accessories. Their creativity seemed boundless, each product building on previous ones, each idea leading to 3 more ideas. Testing their products was its own adventure. They needed to know that everything worked as intended, that the effects were consistent, that the cures actually cured the problems the sweets caused. They tested most things on themselves first, a dangerous but necessary process. They would take turns being the test subject, carefully noting effects, adjusting formulas, making sure that nothing had permanent consequences. When they were confident in a product's safety, they would recruit other students as testers, paying them small amounts for their participation and for their feedback on the experience. Their dorm room became a laboratory of sorts, filled with cauldrons and ingredients, works in progress and failed experiments. Their roommates learned to be careful about what they touched, to argue before eating anything that looked like food, to expect odd smells and occasional small explosions. Lee Jordan was their most faithful assistant, helping with tests, offering suggestions, and generally supporting their entrepreneurial dreams. Other Gryffindors got used to the twins staying up late, working on some new product, arguing in whispers about the proper ratio of ingredients, or the exact wand movement required for a particular enchantment. The resistance against Umbridge escalated throughout the year. The twins defied her educational decrees openly, refused to accept her authority over aspects of student life she had no right to control. They set off elaborate pranks designed specifically to undermine her, to make her look foolish, to show the other students that she was not invincible. When she tried to crack down harder, implementing more restrictions and more punishments, they pushed back harder, creating a cycle of escalation that could only end one way. The breaking point came when Umbridge discovered Dumbledore's army. Betrayed by Marietta Edgecombe, whose mother worked at the Ministry, the DA was exposed. Dumbledore took the blame to protect the students, claimed he had organized the group himself, and was forced to flee before he could be arrested. Umbridge became headmistress, a position she used to implement even more draconian rules. She appointed an inquisitorial squad of students, mostly Slytherins, who were given power to dock house points and assign detentions. The school became increasingly unbearable, a place of fear rather than learning. Fred and George decided that they had had enough. They were of age now, legally adults in the wizarding world. They had their funding from Harry. They had their products. They had learned everything Hogwarts could teach them that they cared to know. There was no point in staying, in submitting to Umbridge's tyranny for another year, just to take exams that they did not need. They would leave, spectacularly, in a way that would be remembered for years. They would make a statement not just about their own freedom, but about resistance itself, about the importance of standing up to tyrants, even when it cost you something. Their exit from Hogwarts became legendary, one of the most talked about events in the school's history. They chose their moment carefully, waiting for maximum impact. When the time came, they retrieved their brooms from where Umbridge had locked them away, banned from playing Quidditch as one of her many punishments. They flew through the corridors of the school, setting off an array of magical fireworks that they had been developing specifically for this purpose. These were not ordinary fireworks. These were Weasley's wildfire whiz-bangs, fireworks that were impossible to get rid of, that multiplied when hit with stunning spells that created dragons made of fire and sparkles that flew through the air. The fireworks turned the school into chaos. Dragons soared through the Great Hall during exams. Rockets bounced off walls and ceilings. Catherine wheels of fire rolled down corridors. The noise was tremendous, the spectacle was magnificent, and the disruption was total. Umbridge tried desperately to stop it, tried every spell she knew, but the fireworks only multiplied, only grew more elaborate, only caused more mayhem. Fred and George flew through it all, grinning wildly, shouting encouragement to the students below, reveling in their final act of defiance. As they flew toward the exit, George turned to Peeves, the poltergeist who had been making life difficult for Hogwarts staff for centuries. "Give her hell from us, Peeves," George said. It was perhaps the first time in history that a student had directly encouraged Peeves to cause chaos. Peeves, who normally answered to no one, saluted them and promised to do exactly that. Then Fred and George flew out the main doors of Hogwarts and away, leaving behind the castle that had been their home for nearly 7 years, flying toward a future they would build themselves. The students left behind erupted in cheers. Even students who had never been particularly friendly with the twins, even some Slytherins, appreciated what they had just witnessed. It was not just about the fireworks or the spectacle. It was about freedom, about refusing to be controlled by someone who had no right to that control. Fred and George had shown that there were limits to authority, that some things were worth sacrificing for, that you could stand up to tyrants and survive. For students living under Umbridge's increasingly oppressive regime, it was a moment of hope, proof that resistance was possible. Minerva McGonagall, the deputy headmistress and head of Gryffindor House, had a memorable reaction. When a swamp appeared in a corridor, one of the twins' final parting gifts, and another teacher asked if she could remove it, McGonagall declined. "I could, but I'm not sure I want to," she said, a rare admission that she supported the twins' rebellion, even if she could not openly say so. She left a small section of the swamp as a memorial to Fred and George's exit, a permanent reminder of their stand against Umbridge. Fred and George flew to London and began the work of actually opening their shop. They had secured a location at number 93 Diagon Alley, one of the most prestigious shopping streets in the wizarding world. The location had previously been occupied by another business, but it was available for lease, and with Harry's investment money and their own savings, they could afford it. The building needed work, needed to be transformed from whatever it had been into the joke shop of their dreams, but they were not afraid of hard work. Transforming the empty shop into Weasley's Wizard Wheezes was a monumental task. They needed to design the interior layout, to create displays that would showcase their products effectively, to establish a stockroom and a workspace where they could continue developing new items. They painted the walls in bright, eye-catching colors. They installed shelves that would hold their various products, organized by category. They created a staircase that led to a second floor with additional shopping space. They added magical elements throughout, products that served as their own advertisement by demonstrating what they could do. The name of the shop itself was carefully chosen. Weasley's Wizard Wheezes announced what they were selling and who was selling it. The alliteration made it memorable, easy to remember and repeat. The apostrophe placement indicated that this was a family business, owned by multiple Weasleys working together. They designed a logo, bright and colourful, featuring their initials and magical elements. They created shopping bags that customers would carry through Diagon Alley, advertising the shop to everyone they passed. Every detail was considered, everything designed to attract attention and communicate fun. They stocked the shop with the products they had already developed, but they also continued creating new items. They wanted to offer things that could not be bought anywhere else, products that were unique to Weasley's Wizard Wheezes. Love potions became a significant part of their inventory, potions that would cause the drinker to become temporarily infatuated with someone. These were controversial, skirting the edges of ethical magic, but they were also enormously popular, particularly with teenage customers. They sold different strengths, from mild crush inducement to powerful obsession, always with instructions on duration and dosage. They developed pygmy puffs, small fluffy creatures that were basically miniature puffskeins, bred specifically to be adorable and low-maintenance pets. The pygmy puffs came in various colours, from pink to purple to blue, and they made soft humming sounds that customers found endearing. They became one of the shop's best-selling items, popular as gifts or as companions for younger witches and wizards. The twins set up a special area of the shop just for the pygmy puffs, allowing customers to interact with them before purchasing, creating an experience rather than just a transaction. The skiving snack boxes that had been popular at Hogwarts were refined and packaged professionally, with colourful boxes that explained what each sweet did and how to use it. The extendable ears were displayed hanging from the ceiling, creating a visual spectacle that drew customers in. The decoy detonators were demonstrated regularly, causing small explosions and commotion that made passers-by stop and investigate. Everything in the shop was designed to be interactive, to invite touching and experimentation, to make shopping an adventure. They also recognized that there was a market for defensive items beyond just joke products. The war was heating up, even if the Ministry still officially denied Voldemort's return for part of that period. People were scared, wanted ways to protect themselves and their families. So Fred and George developed and marketed a line of defense products, shield hats that looked like ordinary hats, but were enchanted to deflect minor hexes and jinxes, shield cloaks that provided the same protection over more of the body, shield gloves for protecting hands during dueling. These items were not foolproof, would not stop serious dark magic, but they provided some protection against common attacks, and that was better than nothing. The Peruvian Instant Darkness powder was marketed as a defensive product, something that could cover an escape or create confusion during an attack. The decoy detonators, while entertaining, were also genuinely useful for distracting attackers or creating diversions. Fred and George found themselves in the strange position of being joke shop owners who were also contributing to the war effort, whose products served both entertainment and practical survival purposes. It was not what they had initially imagined, but they adapted, recognized the need, and filled it as best they could. The shop opened officially in the summer of 1996, and it was an immediate success. Witches and wizards of all ages flooded into Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, eager to see what the famous Weasley twins had created. Parents bought skiving snack boxes despite knowing their children would use them to skip school, unable to resist the nostalgia of their own school days. Students spent their allowances on tricks and pranks, stocking up before returning to Hogwarts. Young couples bought love potions, hopeful that they might tip the scales in their favor. Everyone bought something, drawn in by the energy and joy that permeated every inch of the shop. The twins worked constantly during those early days, serving customers, restocking shelves, demonstrating products, answering questions. They hired a few employees to help manage the workload, fellow young wizards who shared their sense of humor and their work ethic. Verity was one of their first hires, a competent young witch who could handle sales and demonstrations while the twins focused on product development and business management. The shop was open long hours, trying to capture every possible customer, trying to establish themselves as firmly as possible in the competitive Diagon Alley market. Financially, the shop was a gamble. They had startup capital from Harry, but that money would not last forever. They needed to turn a profit quickly, needed to establish a customer base that would keep coming back. The overhead was substantial: rent on the Diagon Alley property, costs of ingredients for their products, wages for their employees, costs of packaging and marketing. For the first few months, they reinvested almost everything back into the business, expanding inventory, improving displays, advertising in the Daily Prophet and other wizarding publications. The risk paid off. Word of mouth spread quickly about Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, about the creative products and the entertaining shopping experience. Students returning to Hogwarts talked about the shop, showed off their purchases, created demand among their classmates. Parents heard about it from their children, visited out of curiosity, and became customers themselves. The shop became a destination, a place people planned visits around, a highlight of any trip to Diagon Alley. Within months, Fred and George were turning a profit. Within a year, they were genuinely successful, making more money than their father had ever made at the ministry, proving that their unconventional path had been the right choice. Their success did not come without costs to their family relationships. Molly was initially furious that they had left Hogwarts without completing their education, without taking their NEWT exams. She saw it as throwing away opportunities, as limiting their future options. She worried that they would fail, that they would end up poor and struggling like she and Arthur had been for so much of their marriage. She could not understand why they would take such a risk, why they would not follow the safer path of completing school and then finding stable jobs. Her anger was born of love and fear, but it was genuine anger nonetheless, and it created tension within the family. Arthur was more understanding, though he had his own concerns. He saw the entrepreneurial spirit in his sons, recognized their talent and their determination. He had spent his own life working a job he loved, but that did not pay well, and he could appreciate that his sons wanted something different. But he also worried about the risks, about what would happen if the business failed, about whether they had rushed into things too quickly. He supported them quietly, visited the shop when he could, offered advice based on his own experiences with bureaucracy and regulations, but he did not openly defy Molly's anger about the situation. Percy's reaction was perhaps the most complicated. Percy had completely bought into the Ministry's denial of Voldemort's return, had chosen his career advancement over his family's word. When Arthur and the rest of the family insisted that Voldemort was back and that the Ministry was wrong, Percy cut ties with them, moved out of the Burrow, refused to speak to his parents or siblings. For Fred and George, this betrayal cut deeply. They had always had a contentious relationship with Percy, had always found him pompous and rule-obsessed, but he was still their brother. His choice to side with the Ministry against the family was something they struggled to forgive. The estrangement from Percy meant that he never visited Weasley's Wizard Wheezes during its early days, never saw what his brothers had built, never acknowledged their success. Fred and George made jokes about it, as they made jokes about everything, but there was real pain beneath the humor. They had lost a brother to politics and pride, and while they put on a brave face, it hurt more than they liked to admit. They dealt with it the only way they knew how, by working harder, by throwing themselves into the shop and into the joy they could create for their customers. The shop continued to grow throughout 1996 and into 1997. They expanded their product line constantly, always developing new items, always looking for the next big seller. They created Wonder Witch products, a line aimed specifically at witches and focused on beauty and romance. These included love potions of various strengths, flirting fancies that made the user more confident and charming, and even some practical items like everlasting elves that helped with makeup application. The Wonder Witch line was controversial among some customers who felt it was manipulative or objectifying, but it sold well enough to justify its existence. They developed more elaborate defensive items as the war situation deteriorated. When the Ministry finally acknowledged Voldemort's return in mid-1996, after the battle at the Ministry where Voldemort himself was seen by multiple witnesses, including the Minister for Magic himself, the entire wizarding world went on alert. Suddenly, everyone wanted defensive items, wanted ways to protect themselves and their families. Weasleys Wizard Wheezes became one of the primary suppliers of such items for ordinary witches and wizards who could not afford expensive custom protections. The Ministry started placing bulk orders for shield cloaks and shield hats, wanting to outfit their auras and other law enforcement personnel with the twins' products. This was both validating and slightly absurd. The same ministry that Percy represented, the same institution that the twins had always viewed with skepticism, was now relying on their inventions to protect its employees. Fred and George filled the orders, took the ministry's money, and used it to further expand their business, all while making jokes about the irony of the situation. They also remained connected to the Order of the Phoenix, the secret organization that Dumbledore had founded to fight Voldemort and his Death Eaters. Fred and George were not full members at first, considered too young and too inexperienced for the most dangerous missions, but they contributed in other ways, providing the Order with extendable ears for intelligence gathering, Peruvian instant darkness powder for escapes and infiltrations, decoy detonators for distractions. Their products had practical applications beyond pranking, and the Order made good use of them. As they came of age, and as the war intensified, Fred and George pushed to be included more fully in the Order's work. They argued that they were adults now, that they had proven themselves capable, that they deserved to fight alongside other Order members, rather than being protected and kept at a distance. Eventually, they were accepted as full members, allowed to participate in missions, included in meetings about strategy and operations. It was a vindication of sorts, proof that they were taken seriously, that their contributions were valued beyond just their products. One of their responsibilities within the Order became protecting their family, particularly their younger siblings who were still at Hogwarts. Ron was in constant danger as Harry Potter's best friend, automatically a target for anyone wanting to hurt Harry. Ginny was dating Harry in their 6th year, making her another target, and she had already proven herself capable of attracting dangerous attention after her possession by Tom Riddle's diary in her 1st year. Fred and George used their connections, their products, and their intelligence to try to keep their siblings as safe as possible in an increasingly dangerous world. They also participated in a mission to move Harry Potter from Privet Drive to the Burrow in the summer of 1997, just before Harry's 17th birthday, when the protective enchantments on his aunt's house would break. The plan involved using Polyjuice Potion to create multiple Harry Potters, 7 total, each accompanied by a member of the Order. The idea was that Voldemort's forces would not know which one was real, would have to split their attention. Fred and George both volunteered to be decoy Harrys, swallowing the foul-tasting potion and transforming into identical copies of the boy who lived. The mission went terribly wrong. They were ambushed almost immediately upon leaving Privet Drive, attacked by Death Eaters and Voldemort himself. The sky erupted in spells, curses flying in all directions, the Death Eaters trying to identify and capture the real Harry. Mad-Eye Moody was killed during the battle, murdered by Voldemort. George was hit by a Sectum Sempra curse cast by Severus Snape, a dark-cutting curse that sliced off his ear and caused him to lose significant amounts of blood. He nearly died, saved only by quick action from Remus Lupin, who was escorting him, and by the healing expertise of various Order members once they reached the Burrow. George's injury was permanent. The ear could not be regrown, not through magic or any other means. Magical injuries from dark curses were often impossible to fully heal, and this was one of those cases. George would spend the rest of his life missing an ear, a visible reminder of the war and its costs. When he regained consciousness after the attack, still weak from blood loss and pain, his first words were a joke. "I'm holy," he said, a pun on holy that made Fred groan and laugh simultaneously. Even in pain, even after nearly dying, George's instinct was to make light of the situation, to reassure everyone that he was still himself despite the injury. Fred was terrified when George was injured, more scared than he had ever been in his life. The twin bond that had always connected them made George's pain almost physical for Fred, made the thought of losing his brother unbearable. For the hours when George was unconscious, when they did not know if he would wake up or if there would be complications, Fred stayed by his side, refusing to leave, holding his twin's hand and willing him to survive. It was perhaps the first time Fred truly confronted the possibility that the war might take George from him, that their bond might be broken by violence and death. The attack on Harry's evacuation party drove home just how serious the situation had become. The Death Eaters were willing to kill to get to Harry. Voldemort himself was participating in attacks, not content to let his followers do all the work. No one was safe, not even in groups, not even with multiple skilled wizards providing protection. The war that had been building for years was now in full force, and casualties were mounting on both sides. Fred and George, who had entered the Order, thinking of it as another adventure, another way to fight authority and do something meaningful, began to understand the true cost of war. The wedding of Bill Weasley and Fleur Delacour took place at the Burrow, shortly after the Battle of the Seven Potters, a moment of joy and celebration in dark times. Fred and George stood as groomsmen for their eldest brother, dressed in formal robes and on their best behavior for the ceremony. The wedding was beautiful, a marquee set up in the garden, guests from throughout the wizarding community attending to celebrate the union. For a few hours, it was possible to forget about the war, to focus on love and family and hope for the future. But the peace did not last. Death Eaters attacked the reception, having learned that Harry Potter was present. The wedding dissolved into chaos, guests disapparating to escape, spells flying as Order members tried to cover the evacuation. Fred and George fought alongside their family, protecting guests, battling Death Eaters, ensuring that as many people as possible escaped safely. The attack ended with the Death Eaters eventually withdrawing, but the message was clear. Nowhere was safe. No gathering was immune from violence. The war would touch every aspect of their lives. In the aftermath of the wedding attack, it became clear that the Ministry of Magic had fallen to Voldemort's control. The Minister for Magic was killed and replaced with a puppet who followed the Dark Lord's orders. New laws were passed. discriminatory regulations targeting Muggleborns, declaring them thieves who had stolen magic from real wizards and witches. The Muggleborn Registration Commission was established, forcing Muggleborns to register with the Ministry and subjecting them to interrogation and often imprisonment. The wizarding world was becoming a police state, fear and oppression spreading through every institution. Despite the danger, despite the fact that resistance could mean death, Fred and George kept their shop open. Weasley's Wizard Wheezes became an act of defiance, a place where people could still laugh, could still find joy in small things. The twins refused to let Voldemort and his Death Eaters steal laughter from the world. They continued developing products, continued serving customers, continued creating moments of happiness even as the world outside grew darker. Their shop became a beacon of sorts, a reminder that the Death Eaters had not won everything, that life continued even under occupation. They had to be careful, of course. Death Eaters would sometimes visit the shop, looking for contraband or for evidence that the twins were supporting resistance efforts. Fred and George learned to be subtle, to hide their true feelings behind smiles and customer service, to separate their inventory into items that were innocuous and items that could potentially be used for resistance. They sold joke items openly while keeping their defensive products in stock but not prominently displayed, available to those who knew to ask but not advertised in ways that would draw unwanted attention. They also used the shop as a cover for order activities. The back room and the upper floors became meeting places for resistance members, locations where information could be exchanged and plans could be made. The shop's constant flow of customers provided excellent cover for people coming and going, made it easy for order members to slip in and out without being noticed. Fred and George's role in the resistance became as much about providing safe spaces and resources as it was about direct action against Death Eaters. One of the more significant resistance efforts they participated in was Potter Watch, an underground radio program that broadcast truthful news about the war. The official ministry-controlled media spread propaganda and lies, reporting Death Eater victories as triumphs of law and order, hiding the true scope of the violence and oppression. Potter Watch, hosted by Lee Jordan under the codename River, provided an alternative, telling people what was really happening, maintaining morale, reminding listeners that resistance continued even when it seemed hopeless. Fred appeared on Potter Watch using the codename Rapier, a reference to his sharp wit and his skill with words as much as his skill with a wand. George used the codename Rodent, though the reason for this choice was never entirely clear, possibly a self-deprecating joke or a reference to something personal between the twins. They would broadcast from different locations to avoid detection, using magic to scramble their signal and make it difficult for the Ministry to track them. They shared news of resistance activities, offered encouragement to those listening, and generally tried to keep hope alive in a time when hope was in short supply. The broadcasts were dangerous. The Ministry was actively hunting for the people behind Potter Watch, and being caught would mean Azkaban prison at best, execution at worst. But Fred and George never considered stopping. The broadcast was too important, reached too many people, did too much good. They were careful, took precautions, changed locations frequently, but they continued broadcasting throughout the darkest period of the war. It was another way they fought, another way they contributed to the resistance, using their voices and their humor as weapons against tyranny. Throughout this period, they worried constantly about their family. Arthur was working at the Ministry, trying to subvert Death Eater control from within while appearing to cooperate. The risk of discovery was constant, and Arthur had already been attacked once by Voldemort's snake Nagini in a previous year. nearly dying from the wounds. Molly was at home, keeping the Burrow as safe as possible, but the protections around their house were not foolproof, and everyone knew the Weasleys were on Voldemort's target list because of their support for Dumbledore and Harry Potter. Ron was on the run with Harry and Hermione, hunting for Horcruxes, the objects containing pieces of Voldemort's soul that had to be destroyed before the Dark Lord could be killed. Fred and George did not know the specifics of what their younger brother was doing. The mission was too secret and too important to share widely, but they knew it was dangerous and that Ron might not survive it. Ginny was at Hogwarts, which was now under Death Eater control with Severus Snape as headmaster. She was participating in resistance efforts there, continuing Dumbledore's army under the leadership of Neville Longbottom and Luna Lovegood, making herself a target for the Carrows, the Death Eaters, who had been appointed as teachers and who used torture as discipline. Bill was living at Shell Cottage with Fleur, trying to maintain some semblance of normal life, while also participating in order missions. Charlie was still in Romania with the dragons, but was in contact with the family and ready to return if needed. Percy remained estranged, still working at the ministry, still refusing to acknowledge that he had been wrong about Voldemort's return, still choosing his career over his family. The separation from Percy continued to hurt, particularly as the danger increased and every family member became more precious. The twins dealt with the stress and fear the only way they knew how, by continuing to create joy, by making jokes, by refusing to let the darkness consume them. They worked on new products even as the war raged, developed new tricks even as people died around them. It was not callousness or lack of concern. It was survival, a recognition that if they stopped laughing, stopped finding reasons to smile, the Death Eaters would have won even before the fighting was over. Joy was resistance, laughter was rebellion, and Fred and George would not surrender either. They also found moments of connection and love during this dark time. Fred grew closer to Angelina Johnson, his former Quidditch teammate, and the girl he had taken to the Yule Ball years earlier. They had always been friends, always had chemistry, but the war made everything more urgent, made it clear that tomorrow was not guaranteed. They began a relationship, tentative at first because of the danger, because starting something when either of them might die seemed cruel. But they could not help it, could not resist the pull toward each other, could not deny themselves happiness just because the future was uncertain. George remained more guarded in his personal relationships, perhaps affected by the injury that had taken his ear, perhaps simply more private about his emotional life. He dated occasionally, but nothing serious, nothing that might create vulnerabilities he could not afford. Or perhaps he simply had not found the right person yet, was waiting for someone who understood him, who could match his energy and his humor. Whatever the reason, George focused more on the shop, on the resistance, on his family, putting romantic relationships on hold until the war was over. The spring of 1998 brought increasing tensions and increasing violence. The Snatchers, bounty hunters who captured Muggleborns and blood traitors for the ministry, were everywhere. Disappearances became common, people vanishing from their homes or their jobs, never to be seen again. The giants joined Voldemort's side, massive creatures who brought devastating power to the Death Eater forces. Dementors, the soul-sucking creatures that had once guarded Azkaban, now worked for Voldemort, spreading despair wherever they went. The world was falling apart, and it seemed like the forces of good were losing. But then, in early May, something changed. Word spread through the resistance network that Harry Potter had broken into Gringotts Bank, had stolen something important, had escaped on a dragon. The details were unclear, But the very fact that Harry was still alive, still fighting, still taking action against Voldemort's interests, gave people hope. If Harry had not given up, if he was still working toward Voldemort's defeat, then the war was not over. There was still a chance, still a reason to keep fighting. Shortly after the Gringotts break-in, a call went out from Hogwarts. The castle itself was under attack, or about to be. Voldemort was gathering his forces to assault the school, to kill Harry Potter once and for all. Dumbledore's army was activating, calling for reinforcements, asking anyone who could fight to come to Hogwarts and stand against the Dark Lord. Fred and George closed the shop, locked the doors, and disapparated immediately to Hogsmeade. They would not miss this battle. Their siblings were at Hogwarts, their friends were at Hogwarts, and Harry Potter, the boy who had made their joke shop possible, was at Hogwarts. They would fight. The Battle of Hogwarts began on the night of May 2nd, 1998. Fred and George arrived to find the castle preparing for siege. Students and teachers were working together to strengthen the magical protections around the school, to seal entrances, to prepare defensive positions. Dumbledore's army members were organizing, assigning people to different areas of the castle, trying to create some kind of coherent defense against the overwhelming forces that were about to attack. The mood was tense but determined. Everyone knew that this was likely the final battle, that win or lose, the war would be decided here. The twins immediately joined the defenders, taking positions alongside their siblings and their friends. Percy appeared as well, having finally broken from the ministry, having finally recognized that his family was more important than his career, having finally chosen the right side. His appearance was emotional, his apology to the family long overdue but genuine. Fred made a joke about it, breaking the tension, accepting Percy back into the fold with humor rather than recrimination. There was no time for lengthy reconciliation, no time for detailed discussions of hurt feelings and betrayals. There was only time to fight together, to stand as a family one more time. The Death Eaters attacked with overwhelming force. Voldemort's army included not just his followers, but also giants, acromantulas from the Forbidden Forest, Dementors, and other dark creatures. The protections around Hogwarts held for a while, but they were eventually broken through. Death Eaters poured into the castle, engaging the defenders in brutal combat. Spells flew through corridors that had once been places of learning and laughter. Students who should have been studying for exams were fighting for their lives. Teachers who had spent years educating young minds were using lethal force to protect those same students. Fred and George fought together as they did everything together. They moved through the castle defending key areas, helping younger students escape to safety, battling Death Eaters with the same coordination they had once used on the Quidditch pitch. Their time in Dumbledore's army served them well. The defensive magic they had learned from Harry, giving them tools to survive and to protect others. They were good fighters, brave and skilled, using their creativity to find unconventional solutions to combat problems, setting traps and ambushes that their opponents did not expect. At one point during the battle, Fred and George were fighting alongside Percy near a corridor in the castle. They were joking, even in the middle of combat, making ridiculous comments about the Death Eaters they were facing, keeping their spirits up despite the chaos around them. Percy, who had spent years being too serious, too focused on propriety and rules, made a joke himself, a genuine funny comment that caught Fred completely off guard. Fred laughed, delighted by this sign that Percy was truly back, that he had remembered how to be part of the family rather than apart from it. And then, An explosion rocked the corridor. The castle wall was blown inward by some massive spell, or by giant activity outside. Stone and debris flew inward, a wave of destruction that hit everyone in the corridor. Fred was caught in the blast, struck by falling stone, killed instantly. One moment he was laughing at Percy's joke, celebrating his brother's return to the family, and the next moment he was gone. There was no warning, no chance to defend himself, no dramatic final words. Just a sudden, terrible end to a life that had been so full of joy and laughter. Percy threw himself over Fred's body, trying to protect him, even though it was far too late for protection. George reached his twin's side moments later, dropping to his knees beside Fred, unable to process what he was seeing. The twin bond that had connected them their entire lives was suddenly, terribly severed. George could feel the absence, the emptiness where Fred's presence had always been. It was like losing part of himself, like having a limb torn away, like the world had suddenly become wrong in a fundamental way that could never be fixed. Ron and Harry pulled Percy and George away from Fred's body, physically dragged them to safety as the battle continued around them. There was no time to mourn, no time to process the loss, no time to do anything but survive. They moved Fred's body to a protected area where other casualties were being laid, covering him as respectfully as they could before returning to the fight. George moved through the rest of the battle in a state of shock, functioning on autopilot, casting spells and defending positions without fully being present. Part of him had died with Fred, and what remained was going through the motions of survival without really understanding why. The battle continued through the night. Voldemort called a ceasefire at one point, demanding that Harry Potter surrender himself or watch everyone else die. Harry, in an act of incredible bravery, walked into the Forbidden Forest to sacrifice himself, believing that his death was necessary to destroy the Horcrux that he had learned was inside him. Voldemort struck him down with the killing curse, apparently winning, apparently achieving his ultimate goal. The Death Eaters marched back to the castle, carrying what they thought was Harry's corpse, declaring victory, demanding surrender. But Harry was not dead. The curse had destroyed the Horcrux inside him without killing him, and he had survived. When Voldemort and his forces attacked the castle again, Harry revealed himself very much alive and confronted the Dark Lord directly. The final duel between Harry Potter and Lord Voldemort took place in the Great Hall, witnessed by everyone who had survived the night. The two wizards circled each other, Harry's wand against Voldemort's Elder Wand, both knowing that only one would walk away. Harry won. The Elder Wand recognized him as its true master rather than Voldemort, and when the Dark Lord cast the killing curse, the wand refused to kill its master. The spell rebounded, killing Voldemort instantly, destroying the last piece of his fragmented soul, ending his reign of terror once and for all. The Death Eaters either fled or surrendered, realizing that without their master, without the source of their power and their confidence, they were defeated. The war was over, good had triumphed over evil, but the cost had been staggering. 50 people died in the Battle of Hogwarts. Students and teachers, Order members and bystanders, all lost to the violence of that terrible night. Remus Lupin and Nymphadora Tonks, both Order members, both parents of a newborn son, were killed. Colin Creevey, a student who had idolized Harry Potter, died defending the castle. Dozens of others fell, each death a tragedy, each loss leaving family and friends behind to mourn. But for the Weasley family, for George in particular, no loss compared to Fred's death. The Great Hall, which had been a battlefield, became a place of mourning. Bodies were laid out, families came to identify their dead, to say goodbye, to weep over losses that could never be recovered. Molly Weasley sat beside Fred's body, holding his hand, her face wet with tears that would not stop. Arthur stood behind her, one hand on her shoulder, his own grief visible in every line of his face. Ron and Ginny clung to each other, crying openly. Percy knelt beside Fred, apologizing over and over for the years they had lost, for the time wasted in estrangement, for not being there when he should have been. George sat alone, slightly apart from the rest of the family, staring at his twin's body, unable to cry, unable to speak, unable to do anything but exist in the terrible emptiness that Fred's death had created. Without Fred, he was not whole. Without Fred, the jokes did not work, the pranks had no point, the laughter felt hollow and wrong. They had done everything together for 20 years. They had been born together, had learned magic together, had built a business together, had fought in the war together. They were supposed to grow old together, to be uncles to each other's children together, to continue making people laugh for decades to come. But now, Fred was dead, and George was left behind, alone, in a way he had never been alone in his entire life. The funerals in the days following the battle were heartbreaking affairs. The wizarding community came together to mourn their dead, to honor the sacrifices that had been made, to begin the long process of healing. Fred's funeral was held at the Burrow, the family home where he had grown up, where he had learned to laugh and to love and to cause chaos. Friends from Hogwarts came, Lee Jordan devastated by the loss of one of his best friends. Angelina came, her grief for the boy she had loved mixed with guilt that she had not told him often enough how much he meant to her. Customers from Weasleys Wizard Wheezes came, strangers who had been touched by Fred's humor and his joy. George delivered the eulogy, standing before the gathered mourners and speaking about his twin. He talked about their childhood, the pranks they had pulled, the dreams they had shared. He talked about their business, the joke shop that represented everything they had wanted to create together. He talked about Fred's bravery, his loyalty to his family and friends, his absolute refusal to let darkness steal joy from the world. He made jokes because that was what Fred would have wanted, because making people laugh even at a funeral was the best tribute he could offer. But his voice broke multiple times, the pain too raw to fully hide behind humor. The Weasley family plot, located near the Burrow, gained a new grave. Fred's headstone was simple but fitting, marked with his name, his dates, and an inscription that captured his philosophy. He made them laugh. There were no grand statements about heroism or sacrifice, no lengthy descriptions of his accomplishments. Just that simple truth, that Fred Weasley had spent his life making people laugh, and that was legacy enough. The family planted wildflowers around the grave, bright and colourful, refusing to let his resting place be sombre or dark. The days and weeks after the funeral were perhaps the hardest George had ever faced. The war was over, which should have been a relief, should have been a cause for celebration. But how could he celebrate when Fred was dead? How could he feel joy when the person who had shared every joyful moment of his life was gone? He returned to the joke shop because he did not know what else to do, but it was not the same. The building that had been filled with energy and laughter now felt empty and quiet. Every product reminded him of Fred, every joke they had developed together, every display they had set up, every customer who came in expecting to see both twins and instead found only George. For months, George barely functioned. He kept the shop open, served customers, maintained inventory, but he was going through the motions without really being present. Part of him wondered if he should close Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, if continuing without Fred was somehow wrong, like he was betraying their partnership by going on alone. But another part of him knew that closing the shop would be the real betrayal, that Fred would have wanted the business to continue, would have wanted people to keep laughing even though he was gone. The family worried about George constantly. Molly tried to get him to move back to the Burrow, to be around family rather than alone in his flat above the shop. Arthur stopped by regularly, offering to help with the business, trying to draw George out of his grief. Ron and Ginny visited when they could, though they were dealing with their own trauma from the war and their own grief over Fred's death. Everyone tried to help, but there was no way to fix what was broken, no way to fill the space that Fred had left behind. Angelina Johnson became one of George's strongest supports during this time. She understood his grief in ways that others could not, because she had loved Fred too, had lost him just as George had. They spent time together, talking about Fred, sharing memories, keeping his presence alive through their stories. It was painful, but necessary, a way of processing the loss, of ensuring that Fred was not forgotten. Angelina had her own complicated grief, guilt mixed with sadness, love mixed with anger at the unfairness of it all. She and George helped each other through it, two people bound by their connection to someone who was gone. Lee Jordan also remained close, helping with the shop when George needed it, providing friendship and support. Lee had lost one of his best friends, had mourned deeply, but he channeled his grief into honoring Fred's memory. He would tell stories about their Hogwarts days, about the pranks they had pulled, about the times Fred had made him laugh so hard he could not breathe. These stories helped, reminded George that Fred had lived a full life, that he had brought joy to so many people, that his death, while tragic, did not erase the good he had done. Slowly, painfully, George began to heal. Healing did not mean forgetting Fred or moving on as if he had never existed. It meant learning to live with the loss, to carry the grief while still finding reasons to continue. It meant accepting that he would always miss his twin, would always feel incomplete, but that he could still have a life worth living. It meant honoring Fred's memory, not by wallowing in sadness, but by continuing the work they had started together, by making sure that Weasley's Wizard Wheezes remained a place of laughter and joy. He made changes to the shop, additions that memorialized Fred while moving the business forward. He created a display dedicated to Fred's favorite products, the items that Fred had been most proud of developing. He added a plaque near the entrance that read, "Co-founded by Fred and George Weasley," ensuring that customers knew Fred's contribution would never be forgotten. He developed new products, sometimes thinking about what Fred would have suggested, how they would have collaborated on the designs. It was bittersweet, working alone, but it was also a way of keeping Fred present in the work. The shop continued to be successful. In the aftermath of the war, people needed laughter more than ever. They needed reminders that life could be fun, that not everything had to be serious and somber. Weasley's Wizard Wheezes provided that, offered an escape from the difficult work of rebuilding the wizarding world. George hired additional staff, expanding the team, because he could not run everything alone the way he and Fred had done together. Verity remained his most trusted employee, taking on more responsibility, helping manage day-to-day operations so George could focus on product development and on his own recovery. In the years following the war, George began to build a life for himself beyond just the shop. It was not easy, and there were setbacks, days when the grief overwhelmed him again, when he could not face customers or work on products. But gradually, he found a new normal. a way of existing in the world. Without Fred, that was not just survival, but actual living. He maintained close relationships with his family, visiting the Burrow regularly, being present for nieces and nephews as they were born, staying connected to the people who loved him. His relationship with Angelina deepened over time. What had started as shared grief became genuine connection, became love of a different sort. They understood each other, had been through trauma together, had learned to find happiness even after loss. Eventually, they married, creating a family that honored Fred's memory while building something new. They named their first son Fred after George's twin, ensuring that the name would continue in the family. Their daughter was named Roxanne, a strong and spirited girl who reminded everyone of the Weasley tendency toward mischief. George proved to be a devoted father, bringing to parenting the same creativity and humor he had brought to everything else in his life. He told his children stories about their Uncle Fred, about the adventures they had shared, about the business they had built. Young Fred grew up knowing about the man he was named after, understanding the legacy he carried. George made sure his children knew how to laugh, how to find joy in small things, how to stand up against unfairness and authority when necessary. He taught them magic and mischief in equal measure, preparing them for a world that would not always be kind, but that could still be wonderful. Weasley's Wizard Wheezes remained a fixture of Diagon Alley for decades. New generations of Hogwarts students discovered the shop, bought skiving snack boxes and extendable ears and pygmy puffs, carried on the tradition of pranking that Fred and George had embodied. The shop expanded over the years, adding new products, responding to changes in wizarding culture, but always maintaining the core philosophy that had guided its creation. Magic should be fun, laughter should be accessible, and joy was worth fighting for. George never fully recovered from Fred's death, because some losses are too profound to recover from completely. But he learned to live with the pain, to carry it alongside the happiness, to honor his twin by continuing to create joy in the world. He remained close with his family, particularly with Ron and Ginny, the siblings who had fought alongside him in the war, who understood what they had all lost. He maintained friendships from his Hogwarts days, stayed connected to Lee Jordan and other members of Dumbledore's army, people who had known him and Fred as the inseparable twins they had been. In his later years, George would sometimes visit Fred's grave at the Burrow, sitting beside the headstone and talking to his twin as if he were still there. He would tell Fred about the shop, about new products they had developed, about young Fred and Roxanne and their adventures. He would share family news, talk about Ron's work as an aura, about Ginny's career playing professional Quidditch, and then writing about the sport, about all the ways the family had grown and changed. Sometimes he would just sit in silence, feeling connected to his twin through the twin bond that had not been entirely severed, even by death. The legacy of Fred and George Weasley extended far beyond just their joke shop, though the shop itself was a significant achievement. They had shown that success did not have to follow traditional paths, that you could build something meaningful by following your passion rather than by conforming to expectations. They had demonstrated that laughter was not frivolous but essential, especially in dark times. They had proven that business could be both profitable and joyful, that making money and making people happy were not mutually exclusive goals. Their impact on Hogwarts culture was lasting. Students still told stories about the twins' spectacular exit, about the fireworks display that had humiliated Umbridge, about the swamp that McGonagall had preserved as a memorial. Their pranks became legendary, inspiring future generations of mischief makers to push boundaries and challenge authority in creative ways. Dumbledore's army members remembered how Fred and George had fought in the war, how they had used their humor and their creativity as weapons against oppression, how they had never stopped laughing even when the world was at its darkest. The family remembered them, Fred directly through stories and grief, George through continued presence and love. Molly kept Fred's room at the Burrow exactly as he had left it, a shrine to her lost son that she would visit when the pain became too much. Arthur would sometimes mention something Fred had said, a joke he had made, keeping his memory alive through casual conversation. Percy never forgave himself for the years he had lost with Fred, for the estrangement that had meant they had so little time together before the end. Ron named one of his own children Rose, after one of Fred's favorite colors, a subtle tribute to the brother he had lost. George's contributions to defensive magic during the war were eventually recognized officially. He received commendations for his work with the Order of the Phoenix, for the products he had developed that had saved lives, for his participation in Potter Watch. He accepted these honors quietly, uncomfortable with praise, always deflecting credit to Fred or to others who had fought alongside him. He never saw himself as a hero, just as someone who had done what needed to be done, who had survived, when others had not, who carried the weight of living on when his twin had fallen. The joke shop remained a family business as George's children grew older. Young Fred showed interest in the work, eventually joining his father in developing new products and managing operations. Roxanne was more interested in the business side, handling accounts and expansion plans. George trained them both, passing on the knowledge he and Fred had accumulated, ensuring that Weasley's Wizard Wheezes would continue even after he was gone. He taught them not just about magic and jokes, but about the philosophy behind it all, about using laughter as resistance, about finding joy in darkness, about the importance of standing up for what you believed in. In the broader wizarding world, Fred and George became cultural icons, symbols of a certain kind of rebellion and creativity. Their story was taught at Hogwarts as part of the history of the Second Wizarding War. Their exit from school during Umbridge's reign presented as a moment of justified resistance against tyranny. Their business success was studied in economics classes, an example of how innovation and passion could create sustainable enterprises. Their joke products were analyzed in academic papers about the intersection of magic and entertainment, about how frivolous-seeming innovations could have serious applications. George lived a long life, longer than Fred had been granted, and he made the most of it. He saw his children grow up, married, have children of their own. He became a grandfather, delighting in the new generation of Weasleys with their red hair and their mischievous streaks. He continued working at the joke shop well into his later years, unwilling to fully retire from the work that had defined so much of his life. He remained active in his community, supporting causes he believed in, using his wealth and influence to make the wizarding world better. But through it all, through every success and every joy, there was always the awareness of absence, the knowledge that someone who should have been there was missing. George learned to live with that absence, to function despite it, to find happiness even knowing that it would always be incomplete. He never remarried after Angelina's eventual death, never sought to replace what he had lost. Content with his children and grandchildren and the memories of the loves he had known. When George eventually passed away, very old and surrounded by family, his last thoughts were of Fred. He wondered if death would reunite them, if the twin bond that had been severed by violence would be restored in whatever came next. He hoped that somewhere, somehow, Fred had been waiting for him all these years, ready to laugh at George's jokes about how long it had taken him to arrive. He hoped that they would be together again, partners in mischief for eternity. two halves made whole once more. George was buried beside Fred in the family plot at the Burrow, their others' headstones matching side by side as they had been in life. The inscription on George's stone read, "He kept them laughing," a compliment to Fred's stone, a recognition that George had continued their work, had honoured his twin by carrying on even when it had seemed impossible. The wildflowers that had grown around Fred's grave spread to George's, creating a riot of colour, a celebration of life even in death. The family gathered for George's funeral, just as they had for Fred's decades earlier. But this time, alongside the grief, there was a sense of completion, a recognition that George had lived a full life, had accomplished incredible things, had raised a family and built a legacy. Young Fred, now himself middle-aged, delivered the eulogy, talking about his father's love and his dedication, his humour and his bravery. He spoke about how George had kept Fred's memory alive, how he had ensured that his twin would never be forgotten, how he had honoured that bond every single day of his life. Weasley's Wizard Wheezes continued after George's death, run by young Fred and Roxanne, carrying on the family tradition. The shop remained a place of laughter and joy, a testament to what Fred and George had created together. New products were developed, new generations discovered the magic of pranking, but the core of what the shop represented never changed. It remained a place where magic was fun, where authority could be challenged, where joy was always within reach. In the years that followed, historians and biographers would try to capture the essence of Fred and George Weasley, to explain their impact on the wizarding world. But the truth was simpler than any academic analysis could convey. They were brothers who loved each other, who made people laugh, who fought against darkness in their own unique way, who showed that even in the worst of times, joy and laughter were not luxuries, but necessities. They were pranksters who became heroes, jokers who became warriors, boys who became legends. Their story resonated because it was fundamentally hopeful. It showed that you did not have to be the chosen one, did not have to be the most powerful wizard, did not have to fit into traditional molds of heroism to make a difference. You could change the world by making people smile, could fight tyranny through laughter, could build something meaningful by following your passion. Fred and George proved that there were many ways to be brave, many ways to resist, many ways to matter. For those who knew them, who had been touched by their humour, or helped by their products, or inspired by their defiance, Fred and George Weasley would never be forgotten. They lived on in stories and memories, in the continued success of their joke shop, in the children who bore their names and carried their legacy forward. They lived on in every prank pulled by Hogwarts students, in every moment of laughter that pierced through darkness, in every act of creative rebellion against unjust authority, and perhaps in some way that transcended death, they lived on together, the twin bond restored, partners once more in whatever adventure came next. Because if magic could do anything, if there was any justice in the universe, Fred and George Weasley would be together for eternity, making each other laugh, planning their next prank, inseparable in death as they had been in life. The wizarding world was better for having known them, was brighter for the light they had brought into it, was forever changed by two red-haired twins who refused to let darkness win. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, remember Fred and George Weasley. Remember that laughter is powerful, that joy is revolutionary, that the bonds between those we love transcend even death itself. Remember that you can make a difference in your own unique way, that traditional paths are not the only paths, that following your passion and your heart can lead to extraordinary things, Remember that even in the darkest times, there are reasons to smile, reasons to hope, reasons to keep fighting for a better world. Sleep well, and may your dreams be filled with laughter and light, with mischief and magic, with the kind of joy that Fred and George spent their lives creating. Thank you for joining me tonight on Sleep 2 Cinema. If you enjoyed this journey through the lives of Fred and George Weasley, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more explorations of the stories and characters that make our favorite films so memorable. Until next time, sweet dreams.